I'm now joined by Brooks Newmark, writer and visiting academic at the University of Oxford. Brooks, first of all, thank you for coming in. You've been very involved in Ukraine, and you've written an article for the Catholic Herald explaining Iran's involvement. How can you be so certain that Iran is involved?
Well, I think you have to look historically. Hamas, in their attacks in the past on Israel, have been somewhat intermittent, chaotic, nothing of this scale. In order for Hamas to execute something of this enormity, of this scale, without the intelligence services in Israel picking it up, they needed a major state behind them. There's no way they could have pulled this off. And I think all fingers seem to be certainly pointing to Iran. Why? Because there is, as one can see on social media, there were meetings between senior Hamas officials, between senior Iranian Revolutionary Guard officials, and even to connect the dots, there were then meetings between people from the Russian Foreign Ministry and the Russian military with the Iranians. So there's this, at the end of the day, Hamas has been used to further the ends of two objectives. One, there is no way Iran wanted Saudi to sign the Abraham Accords.
Why is this so important to Iran? What is the risk to Iran of Saudi Arabia signing the Abraham Accord?
Well, because then what happens is the bugbear, Israel, which historically Saudi has been a big funder of the Palestinians, of Hamas, and so on, that would then be removed. That then gives their big enemy, which is Israel, which I've still never understood because the Iranian border, of course, is nowhere near there, it then creates an imbalance of regional power. So Saudi and Iran regionally have always sort of vied for who's the most powerful. And this would enable them, because they would then get more support from the West, particularly from the US, military support and so on, to effectively be the regional superpower.
And that's Iran's big fear, because Iran has been hostile to Saudi Arabia and indeed different branches of Islam in Iran and Saudi Arabia in competition over religious motives as well as everything else. And so by trying to make the relationship between Saudi Arabia and the West more broadly difficult, Iran strengthens its own position. That's your basic thesis.
Correct. Or the flip side of that coin, they don't want Saudi's position to be strengthened. So the implication of that is then their position is weakened. So at the moment, who'd have ever imagined that, the UAE, for example, would have signed the Abraham Accords to have peace with Israel? They did. Qatar, even though Qatar has not signed it, certainly during the World Cup, they allowed Israelis into the country. So there's been this rapprochement with the Gulf states and Israel.
Well, to an extraordinary kind. The ambassador from the UAE, forgive me name dropping, told me last year that it was easier from the UAE nowadays to get into Israel than it was to get into London, which is not something we should be particularly proud of. But the other part of this is Russia, because what seems to be happening seems to be beneficial to Russia as well, because we've had announcements that funding may be diverted to Israel from Ukraine, and therefore it takes the pressure off Russia to some degree.
So the sort of Russian narrative on media has had a big impact on certain elements within the Republican Party. The Republican Party, the Gates, Congressman Gates, and Marjorie Taylor Greene from, I think it's Georgia, they have been able to effectively hold the US government hostage because they oppose funding for Ukraine. Now, if you're Putin, you're sort of thinking there, let me sort of get in there somehow. And if I can help cause some problems in the Middle East with Israel, who is the US's biggest ally in the Middle East, then it gives those Republicans an excuse to say, well, fine. Even though we're not going to support Ukraine, we will support Israel.
But Israel has a complex relationship with Russia as well, doesn't it? So Russia has interests in Israel. It doesn't want to alienate the Israelis too much.
Well, it's actually the other way around. So effectively, the Russians have given Israel a free hand when it comes to dealing with effectively the new Hezbollah, who has been developing in Syria. So what's happened over the term of this civil war in Syria is there's been a new Hezbollah developed. So we have one in Lebanon, and now we have one emerging in Syria. So what Putin has effectively said is, look, I will let you have a free hand there, but you cannot be overtly supporting Ukraine in any way. And given that Israel's biggest interest is protecting its borders,
understandably,
particularly with Syria, that is effectively the deal Netanyahu did.
And how concerned are you that at the moment the West is allowing its enemies to make the running, that we have a lot of stories telling Israel not to overreact and to pull its punches in response? We have a distraction from Ukraine. We have Saudi Arabia having pulled out of discussions on the Abraham Accord. Is this all going the way our enemies would want it? And what should we do to respond?
Well, at the end of the day, it's up to the US is the superpower when it comes to the West. So, we can react, we can do what we want, even many European countries can do what they wish. But clearly, US leadership when it comes to NATO is critical. And unfortunately, there's been very weak US leadership when it comes to Russia, when it comes to the Palestinian issue, when it comes to Iran. So just to give you an example, I think it was Biden sent, I think it was $6 billion to Iran in the past few weeks.
And when we sent 400 million last year, so the UK has been doing this as well. The whole of the West has been weak in this sense.
But in a way to try and re-engage in a positive way with Iran. How have they been rewarded? Not at all. What has happened is Iran has continued to undermine our allies in the Middle East and has done, as far as I'm concerned, has been responsible for orchestrating this attack by Hamas on Israel.
And so you've got the Republicans on one side not funding Ukraine. And
it's actually the majority of Republicans.
But enough of them. But enough
a small
of them.
minority.
Yes,
it's the tail that wags the dog. It's the same thing in Israel.
So
it's the religious extremists in Israel that are wagging the dog, tail wagging the dog.
But it's
Netanyahu's
political
government as well.
differences in the US are causing a degree of weakness in the response.
Yes.
Brooks, thank you very much indeed.